6 artifacts, 6 museum cases, and every single one of them was supposed to be impossible. A Norse longhouse on the coast of Newfoundland, 500 years before Columbus. A bronze Buddha from the Swat Valley sitting in a Viking workshop in a Swedish lake. Roman gold coins buried with a 9th century woman in a chamber grave. Chinese porcelain in the dirt of a medieval European port. A Roman city in Morocco that was supposed to die in the 3rd century and somehow kept living for another 600 years. And a 1,000-year-old Icelandic saga that turned out to be a navigation chart. These are not legends. Every artifact in this video can be touched today in a real museum with a real catalog number. They have been carbon dated, measured, photographed, and analyzed. What they have not been is fully absorbed by the textbooks. The medieval world we were taught in school is a much smaller place than the medieval world the dirt keeps giving back. Today, 6 discoveries that do not fit the official timeline, and what their existence forces us to admit about how connected, how mobile, and how stubbornly persistent medieval people actually were. Newfoundland, the summer of 1960. A Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad steps off a small medical boat at the northern tip of Canada in a fishing village of fewer than 100 people called Lance aux Meadows. He is looking for something every serious historian of his generation considers a fairy tale: physical proof that Vikings reached North America. He asks a local fisherman named George Decker if he has ever noticed strange mounds in the grass. Decker leads him out to the meadows. The mounds are there. What Anne Stein Ingstad's team uncovered over the next 8 years was an 11th century Norse settlement. 8 buildings, iron nails, a ring-headed pin, a soapstone spindle whorl, the kind a Norse woman would have used. The architecture matched Greenland and Iceland exactly. Radiocarbon dating placed it between 990 and 1050 of the Common Era, roughly 500 years before Columbus. For the first time in modern scholarship, a saga had been promoted from literature to fieldwork. The site was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1978, and here is what the textbook captions still tend to soften. The conventional story said Europeans discovered the Americas in 1492. That story was not slightly wrong. It was off by half a millennium, and the evidence had been sitting in plain sight, under grass, in a place where local fishermen had been pointing at the mounds for years. From the meadows of Newfoundland, we move east, across the North Atlantic, and into the lakes of central Sweden, where the next find rewrites how far medieval trade networks actually reached. Lake Mälaren, the island of Helgö. The year is 1954, and a Swedish archaeologist named Wilhelm Holmqvist begins excavating what looks, at first, like an ordinary migration period workshop site. By the 3rd season, in July of that summer, his team is digging through the floor of a hall belonging to a metalworking community that thrived from roughly the 5th through the 9th centuries of the Common Era. And then, in the dirt of that hall, they find a bronze figurine about 10 centimeters tall. It is a Buddha, sitting in lotus position, a third eye on his forehead, an urna on his brow, long royal earlobes, a double lotus throne. He was cast in the late 5th or early 6th century, almost certainly in the Swat Valley or Kashmir region of what is now the Pakistan-India borderland. When found, he still had the remains of a leather strap looped around his neck and left arm, the kind of strap a merchant wears to carry a small statue under their clothing across a continent. The figure was put on display at the Swedish History Museum in Stockholm, where it sits today. The same hoard from Helgö contained a Coptic bronze ladle from 6th century Egypt and an Irish bishop's crozier from around the year 800. 3 artifacts, 3 civilizations, 1 Viking-era hall on a Swedish lake. The trade networks the textbooks describe as regional were running, in practice, from Kashmir to the Mediterranean to Ireland to the Baltic, and converging in a metalworking village most people have never heard of. A figurine carved by a craftsman who had probably never heard the word Sweden ended up 9,000 kilometers from where it was made, hanging on a leather thong around the neck of someone who carried him all the way north. If you find that ordinary documentaries tell this kind of story too flatly, too tidy, too softened, the subscribe button is how this channel finds you. Now, from Helgö, we move a few dozen kilometers across Lake Mälaren to a Viking Age trading town where the dirt produced something even harder to place. Birka, founded around 750 of the Common Era. By the time it was abandoned, 200 years later, it had been one of the most important commercial hubs of the Viking world, and one of the most thoroughly excavated. Generations of archaeologists have walked that island. They have cataloged more than 3,000 graves, and what they pulled out of the dirt, from the graves of women buried in the 9th and 10th centuries, was not what the standard picture of Viking Sweden had led anyone to expect. Late Roman gold coins from Milan, Ravenna, Constantinople, Frankish glass fragments, Arabic dirhams from the Abbasid Caliphate, and, in 2015, the most discussed example of all, a silver alloy ring set with a violet stone, recovered from a 9th century woman's chamber grave, carrying an Arabic Kufic inscription read by researchers as Illallah, 4 or 2, Allah. The ring had reached Sweden in such pristine condition that materials analysis suggested it had passed through very few hands between the Islamic foundry that made it and the Norse woman who was buried with it. It is now held by the Swedish History Museum. Conventional histories of early medieval Europe like to draw a hard wall around the year 800. Christian Europe on one side, the Islamic world on the other. Contact mostly through warfare and Iberia. The graves of Birka say something else. They say that a Viking woman in central Sweden died wearing the ring of an Islamic craftsman, surrounded by Roman coins struck centuries before her birth, in a town whose harbor saw goods from 4 directions of the medieval world. The textbook map of the 9th century is a much smaller world than the dirt of Birka was actually living in. Quick aside before the next case, drop your country in the comments. I am genuinely curious how far this story has traveled, because the next find pushes the trade network problem even further. From a Viking grave on a Swedish lake, we move to the medieval ports of Western Europe, where the dirt has been giving up something that should not, by any conventional account, be there. Chinese ceramics, in the soil of medieval European archaeological digs. Not in the famous post-Marco Polo period, when a trickle of Asian luxury goods is reasonably documented. Earlier. Sherds of Chinese porcelain, including pieces identified as Tang-era and Song-era stoneware and white wares, have been recovered from medieval contexts in ports along the Mediterranean and at sites tied to the Crusader period Eastern Mediterranean trade. The pieces are real. They are cataloged in museum collections, including at institutions like the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which holds Chinese ceramic material associated with medieval European exchange. They are small, they are damaged, they are unmistakably Chinese. The standard explanation is straightforward enough, as far as it goes. Chinese ceramics moved along the Silk Road and through the Indian Ocean trade to the Islamic world, and from the Islamic world, a fraction made its way into European hands, first as diplomatic gifts, then as elite curios, eventually as imitable luxury goods that European kilns spent centuries trying to copy. That account is true. What it tends to leave out is how early some of these fragments arrive, and how far inland a few of them turn up. A medieval European household using a Chinese cup is a household connected, however indirectly, to a kiln 8,000 kilometers east. And here is the uncomfortable part for the simple version of the medieval story. The European Middle Ages were not a closed room. They were a slow, leaky, uneven, but real participation in a Eurasian trade system that ran from the South China Sea to the Atlantic. The official archaeology has known this for decades. The popular picture has not entirely caught up. When the dirt of a 13th century European port gives up a piece of porcelain made under the Song dynasty, the answer is not that something miraculous happened. The answer is that the medieval world was always larger than the textbooks made it sound. Of the cases we have walked through so far, has any one of them already changed your picture of the medieval world? Hold that thought, because the next case shifts the problem from movement of objects to survival of an entire city, in a place that was not supposed to be alive, northern Morocco, the site of Volubilis. In the textbook timeline, this is a Roman provincial capital that flourished from roughly the 1st to the 3rd centuries of the Common Era, then declined sharply with the Roman administrative withdrawal from Mauritania Tingitana, then went silent. That was the story for a long time. It was wrong. What the excavations at Volubilis have shown confirmed by archaeology, by inscriptions, by changes in burial practice and architecture, is that the city did not die when the Romans left. The Berber population stayed. They kept the streets, kept some of the buildings, adapted others. Latin inscriptions continue into the 7th century. The city was occupied through the late Antique period, through the arrival of Islam, into the Idrisid era at the end of the 8th century, when Idris I made it one of the foundational sites of the first Moroccan Islamic dynasty. Volubilis was not abandoned in 285 of the Common Era, the way older textbooks implied. It kept going for another 6 centuries under different management. This is the case that bothers historians the most quietly. The Roman cities collapsed when the empire pulled out model is a clean story. The actual evidence at Volubilis is messier and more interesting. A Berber Roman Christian Islamic continuity on the same site across more than 700 years. The archaeology has been pushing back against the collapse narrative for decades. The popular story has barely begun to shift. Of the discoveries we have walked through, the next one is the case I find hardest to dismiss. It is the moment a 1,000-year-old text stopped being literature and became a map. Stay with me. It is also the case where the dirt and the manuscript line up almost perfectly. The saga of Eric the Red, composed in Iceland in the 13th century, describes voyages 2 centuries earlier, Eric the Red's settlement of Greenland in the late 10th century, and his son Leif's voyages further west to a land of meadows, salmon, and timber that Leif called Vinland. For most of the modern era, scholars treated these sagas the way they treated other medieval epics, useful as cultural documents, unreliable as geography. Then the Ingstads found Lens aux Meadows, and once that site was confirmed, a generation of archaeologists went back to the saga with a different set of questions. What if the place names were navigational? What if Helluland, land of flat stones, was Baffin Island? What if Markland, forest land, was the Labrador coast? What if the saga's descriptions of currents, of butter yellow grass, of a salmon-filled lake, were not poetic flourishes but sailors' notes? The matches are not perfect. They are good enough that no serious modern scholar of Norse expansion treats the Vinland sagas as pure fiction anymore. The radiocarbon dates from Lens aux Meadows fall between 990 and 1050. The saga places the voyages around the year 1000. 2 independent pieces of evidence, separated by 9 centuries and an ocean, agree. Eric the Red's settlements on Greenland's western coast have likewise been excavated, dated, and tied to the saga geography, Brattahlid, Gardar, the eastern and western settlements. The official archaeology calls these correlations broadly consistent. That is the academic register. In plain English, it means a 13th century Icelandic poet was writing down sailing directions that worked. 6 discoveries, 6 museums, 6 places where the dirt does not match the syllabus. The medieval world the textbooks gave us is small, parochial, and largely sealed off from the wider human story until the late 15th century. The medieval world the artifacts describe is a vast, slow, leaky network. Norse longhouses on the Newfoundland coast, an Indian Buddha in a Swedish workshop, an Islamic ring on a Viking woman's hand, Chinese porcelain in European dirt, a Berber city outliving the empire that built it, an Icelandic poem turning out to be a navigation chart. None of these cases requires aliens. None requires lost civilizations. All of them require a more uncomfortable admission. The medieval world was bigger, more connected, and more stubborn than the picture we were taught. What we are looking at when we line these 6 cases up is not a series of accidents. It is a pattern. The textbooks were written before the dirt finished talking. Every generation of archaeologists rewrites the medieval period a little, and every generation finds that the previous picture was a little smaller than the world actually was. The artifacts are real. The captions are catching up. Of the 6 discoveries we walked through today, the Vinland Longhouse, the Helgo Buddha, the Birka graves,